Emma had always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. It was just part of who she was. She wasn't wealthy. In fact, growing up with a single mom who juggled 2 jobs taught her to value kindness over appearances. That's why, on the day she was supposed to meet her fiancé's father, the powerful, elusive billionaire Alexander Ford, she didn't think twice before making a sudden stop. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon. Emma wore a pale blue dress and held a carefully packed lunchbox she had made earlier for herself. She was on her way to the Ford estate, a massive mansion just outside the city. Her fiancé, Ryan, had spent weeks preparing her for this day, emphasizing how crucial it was to impress his father. Emma had listened, of course, but she wasn't the type to pretend or perform. She just wanted to be herself. Halfway down the street, while waiting at a red light near the estate's gates, she noticed a man sitting on the sidewalk. His clothes were ragged, his face sunburned, and his hands trembling slightly as he tried to sip from a paper cup. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Emma slowed down, rolled down her window, and called out gently, "Sir, are you hungry?" The man looked up, surprised. His eyes were piercingly blue beneath his tangled gray hair. "Starving," he replied hoarsely. Without hesitation, Emma pulled over. She got out of her car, walked over, and handed him the lunchbox. "It's homemade. Chicken with rice and some apples. I hope it's okay." The man smiled. "It's more than okay. Thank you." Emma stayed a moment longer, asking his name. "People call me Jack," he said. "Nice to meet someone like you, Emma." "How'd you know my name?" she asked, blinking. He winked. "Lucky guess." Though puzzled, she didn't think much of it. She just offered a kind smile, wished him well, and hurried back to her car. She was already 10 minutes late. As she drove through the massive iron gates of the Ford estate, anxiety crept in. The driveway seemed endless. Towering hedges, a marble fountain, and pristine landscaping led up to a mansion that looked like something out of a royal documentary. Emma parked, checked her reflection, and whispered, "You've got this," before walking up the grand steps. Inside, everything was as intimidating as she feared. An older woman with sharp eyes opened the door. "You're late," she said. "Mr. Ford doesn't like to be kept waiting." Emma apologized, cheeks flushed, and followed the woman down a long, echoing hallway. She could hear murmurs, glasses clinking, and silverware being arranged. "This way," the woman said, gesturing toward an ornate dining room. Emma took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she would meet the man who could determine her future in this family. She pushed the doors open and stopped cold. There, at the head of the massive mahogany table, surrounded by finely dressed guests and a glowing chandelier above, sat the same man she had just fed on the street. Same eyes, same face. Only now he was clean-shaven, dressed in a tailored navy suit, and sipping wine from a crystal glass. He looked up at her calmly and said, "Emma, glad you could join us." Her heart stopped. Her mind raced. That wasn't just any guest. That was Alexander Ford, her fiancé's father, and he was Jack. Emma forced a polite smile, though her insides were in chaos. She walked into the room, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor, echoing her every step like a drumbeat of anxiety. The other guests stared at her with a mix of curiosity and restrained amusement. Ryan stood to greet her, visibly tense, his eyes darting between her and the man at the head of the table, his father. "Emma, this is my dad. Alexander," Ryan said stiffly. Emma nodded, still trying to reconcile the image of the homeless man from the sidewalk with the impeccably dressed mogul before her. "Nice to meet you." "Again," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Alexander chuckled softly. "I believe we've already met. Your lunch was excellent, by the way." A few people around the table chuckled, but most looked confused. Emma wasn't sure whether to laugh, apologize, or run out of the room. She sat down beside Ryan, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The room was filled with tension disguised as politeness. Conversations resumed, but the tone was strange, forced. The guests spoke in clipped, overly formal phrases. Emma tried to keep up, but her thoughts were spinning. Ryan leaned over and whispered, "What's going on? Why were you late?" Emma hesitated before replying. I gave my lunch to a man on the street. I didn't know it was your father." Ryan's eyes widened in disbelief, but before he could respond, Alexander cleared his throat. "Emma, I'd like to thank you for your kindness earlier today," he said, lifting his glass slightly in her direction. Not many people stop to help someone who appears to have nothing. Emma blushed, unsure of how to respond. I didn't know who you were," she managed. "And that's exactly why it mattered," Alexander said firmly, scanning the room. "Too many people around this table would have walked right past me." His gaze lingered meaningfully on a well-dressed couple to his right, who suddenly looked very interested in their wine glasses. The room grew quiet. Ryan looked at his father, confused and slightly angry. "Why did you do that? Why pretend to be homeless?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Because, son, I've built my life surrounded by people who want something from me. Money, power, influence. I needed to know who Emma really was before she became part of this family." Emma's stomach turned. Was this whole thing some kind of test? A trap? She felt exposed, like a specimen under a microscope. "You could have just talked to me," she said softly. "True," Alexander replied. "But talk is cheap. Actions reveal character." The silence returned, heavy and uncomfortable. One of the older guests, a woman in pearls, gave a disapproving huff. "This seems rather unorthodox, Alexander. Are we vetting people like game show contestants now?" Alexander turned to her calmly. "No, Judith. We're simply watching who offers lunch to a hungry man and who doesn't." Emma looked around the table, noticing for the first time the subtle ways people had distanced themselves from her. Some fidgeting, some avoiding her gaze. She realized this wasn't just awkward. She had disrupted something deeper. Ryan shook his head in disbelief. "You still should have told me. This is insane." Alexander nodded. "Perhaps, but I've lost too much to flattery and false smiles. I needed truth." Emma sat silently, her appetite gone, her heart pounding. This was not how she imagined her first dinner with her future in-laws. What was supposed to be a warm welcome had turned into a bizarre social experiment. And yet, beneath the discomfort, something else flickered in her chest. Pride. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been kind even when she thought no one was watching. Maybe that meant something more than polished introductions and perfect timing. Still, the atmosphere was thick with judgment and uncertainty. Emma wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew this night was far from over. Dinner continued in strained silence, the clinking of silverware and distant murmurs filling the massive room like background noise in a dream. Emma could feel the weight of every glance, every whisper passed between guests who still hadn't processed what had just happened. She sat with her back straight, resisting the urge to shrink into herself, while Alexander, the man she now understood to be a billionaire in disguise, acted as though nothing was unusual. He passed the roast, poured wine, and casually asked guests about their businesses and travels. But every so often, he looked directly at Emma, his piercing blue eyes full of silent calculation. Ryan was fuming. He barely touched his plate and refused to look at his father. Finally, unable to hold it in, he said, "You humiliated her. You turned our first meeting into a circus." Alexander didn't flinch. "What I did was reveal something about her that no conversation could. You may see it as a circus, but I see it as clarity." Emma wanted to defend herself, but she sensed this wasn't her moment to speak. It was a father and son clashing, and she had unknowingly been dropped into the center of their battle. Ryan stood, his chair screeching against the polished floor. "This is exactly why I stopped bringing people home. You test everyone. You control everything. And you wonder why Mom left." A collective gasp escaped from one of the guests. Emma's eyes widened. That hadn't been mentioned before. Alexander stayed calm, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "This isn't about your mother, Ryan. It's about trust. Something I've spent a lifetime losing in the people around me. And you think testing my fiancé like she's some kind of charity case is how you build trust?" Ryan's voice cracked with emotion. Emma stood too, her voice firm but calm. "Please, both of you. This doesn't have to be a fight. She turned to Alexander. I didn't help you because I wanted approval. I didn't even know who you were. I helped because I've been hungry before. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on our table. I know what it's like to feel invisible. That's all. The room went quiet again. Even the clinking of forks stopped. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and for the first time, his face softened. That's exactly why I did this, Emma. Not to humiliate you, but to see something real. I've been surrounded by masks for too long. I needed to know my son was marrying someone who sees people for who they are, not what they have. He looked at the other guests, many of whom were now visibly uncomfortable. Most of you would have stepped over me in the street. Some of you have. But Emma stopped. She saw a man, not a label. Emma sat down again, her heart still racing. She didn't know if she should feel honored or manipulated. Maybe both. Ryan remained standing, torn between frustration and pride. So what now? You just wanted to prove a point? Alexander picked up his glass and swirled the wine. What now? Is we eat. And after that, we talk. Like a family. Honestly, finally. The dinner resumed, albeit with more silence than before. Emma noticed that the dynamic had shifted. Alexander no longer seemed like the untouchable mogul. He was human now, flawed, intense, and deeply lonely in a way that power couldn't fix. She had passed his strange, silent test. But at what cost? What kind of family had she just walked into? As the evening wore on and dessert was served, the air began to settle, though the tension still hovered like a low fog. Emma sat quietly, sipping from her glass of water, watching as Alexander made polite conversation with the guests, but his eyes kept drifting back to her and Ryan. Something about his presence was commanding, not just because of his wealth or reputation, but because he was always calculating, always watching. When the plates were cleared and guests began moving into the adjacent lounge, Alexander stood and gestured for Emma and Ryan to follow him. He led them into a smaller sitting room lined with books and antique clocks. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Let's speak freely now, he said, removing his jacket and placing it over a chair. Emma sat on the edge of a leather armchair while Ryan crossed his arms, refusing to sit. You tested her like she was a lab rat, Ryan snapped. That's not how you treat people. Alexander nodded slowly. I understand why you're angry, but you need to understand something, Ryan. After your mother left, I trusted no one. Every woman I dated after her saw me as a prize to be won, not a person to be understood. When you brought Emma into the picture, I had to know, was she like the rest? Emma's jaw clenched. And what if I had walked past you? What if I had just driven by? Alexander looked her in the eye. Then I would have known. It wouldn't make you a bad person, but it would have told me something about your instincts, your values. I've had too many people smile at me across a dinner table while stabbing me in the back outside of it. Ryan finally sat down, rubbing his temples. You're broken, Dad. You think everything is a game to be controlled. Emma's not like the others. She didn't even want to come tonight, not because she's ungrateful, but because she doesn't care about the money. Alexander leaned back, exhaling deeply. That's exactly why she's the only person at that table I trust right now. Emma blinked, unsure whether to feel flattered or disturbed. I didn't ask for your trust, she said calmly. I gave a man lunch because he looked hungry, not because I wanted to earn a seat at your table. Alexander smiled faintly. And that's precisely why you belong at it. For a moment, silence settled over the room, heavier than before. Then he stood and walked over to a cabinet, pulling out an old photo. This was your mother and me before the money, before the suits and the headlines. We were young, in love, and happy. Then the wealth came, and with it, the wolves. I started testing people because I couldn't afford to be fooled anymore. Ryan looked at the photo and softened slightly. Maybe you should have tested yourself first. Alexander chuckled bitterly. Fair point. He turned to Emma. I owe you an apology. You didn't deserve to be made part of this family's dysfunction, not like that. But you showed something tonight that none of the others did. Compassion without calculation. Emma nodded slowly. I understand why you did it, but I'm not a puzzle to solve. I'm a person. And if I'm going to be part of this family, I need to know I won't be tested at every turn. Alexander looked at her solemnly. You have my word. No more tests. Just honesty. He extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Emma took it. Ryan exhaled sharply, then leaned back in his seat. For the first time that night, it felt like the war between them had quieted. Maybe not resolved, but paused. The three of them sat in silence, the air finally lighter. For better or worse, something had shifted. Later that night, as the last guests departed and the estate grew quiet, Emma wandered alone through the grand hallways, absorbing everything that had happened. She had come expecting a formal dinner, a few pleasantries, maybe some stiff introductions. Instead, she'd been thrown into an elaborate moral labyrinth, orchestrated by a man who trusted no one and tested everyone. She found herself in front of a large painting in the main hallway, a portrait of Alexander in his younger days, standing beside a woman with striking resemblance to Ryan, his late wife, no doubt. Emma stared at it, trying to piece together the man behind the strategy. He wasn't just powerful or paranoid, he was broken by betrayal, twisted by years of suspicion and surrounded by people who wore masks. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Alexander came to stand beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. She was everything to me, he said quietly. When she left, something in me shut down. I stopped believing people could be good without wanting something in return. Emma kept her eyes on the painting. And that's why you dressed like a homeless man? To test if people still could? He nodded. It's extreme, I know. But when you have wealth, everyone wears a face. You lose track of who's real. Emma turned to him. That doesn't justify what you did, but I understand it. What you saw in me, kindness, I didn't think it was rare. It shouldn't be. Alexander's face tightened. It is rare. That's the tragedy. When I sit at that table with business partners, socialites, and so-called friends, I see people measuring what they can gain. But you looked at me like I mattered, even when I had nothing. Emma's voice was steady. Because you did matter. Every person does. That shouldn't surprise you, it should be the standard. He smiled faintly. Then maybe I've forgotten what the standard is. Maybe you're here to remind me. She looked back at the painting. You could have just had a conversation, you know. People might surprise you if you let them in. Alexander chuckled softly. I'm not used to people telling me how I should behave, but I'll consider it. Emma faced him fully now. If you want me to be a part of this family, I need to know that I won't be constantly under suspicion. I don't play games. I don't manipulate. I just want to live honestly with the man I love. Alexander's expression turned serious. And you have that. My word. He paused. Ryan's lucky, and I think maybe I am too. Emma gave him a small nod, then walked past him, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Behind her, Alexander remained in front of the portrait, gazing at the woman he had once loved and lost, perhaps thinking about the ways he had changed and the cost of those changes. Emma didn't look back. She had faced the heart of a storm that wasn't hers and emerged with her integrity intact. And in doing so, she hadn't just proven herself to a powerful man, she had reminded him what it meant to be human. The following morning, the mood in the estate had shifted. The cold formality that once defined the Ford household had given way to a fragile but genuine warmth. Emma awoke to the sound of birds outside her window and soft sunlight pouring in through sheer curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The previous night had been so surreal. It almost felt like a dream, until she remembered everything. The test, the dinner, the confrontation, and Alexander's strange mixture of control and vulnerability. As she made her way downstairs, she found Ryan in the kitchen, already dressed and sipping coffee. He looked up, relief flashing across his face. Morning, he said softly, walking over to kiss her forehead. Sleep okay? Emma nodded. Surprisingly, yes. I think I was too exhausted to process anything else. Ryan chuckled. Same. I'm still wrapping my head around what my dad pulled. He paused, then looked at her seriously. You handled it better than I ever could have. I'm sorry he put you through that. Emma reached for a mug and poured herself some coffee. He's complicated, but I think he meant it when he said he trusted me now. Ryan leaned against the counter. That's saying something. I don't think I've ever heard him say those words to anyone. Before Emma could respond, Alexander walked in. He wasn't in a suit this time. Just slacks and a sweater, looking almost casual, human even. Good morning, he said with an awkwardness that made Emma smile. I hope you both slept well. Ryan gave a neutral nod. We did. Alexander glanced at Emma. I owe you both an apology. Not just for the test, but for letting my paranoia define our first meeting. You deserved better. Emma stepped forward. Thank you for saying that. What matters now is where we go from here. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Agreed. Which is why I've decided to make a change. Starting today. Ryan raised an eyebrow. What kind of change? Alexander hesitated, then took a breath. I'm stepping back from a few things, some business boards, social circles that don't serve me anymore. I need to make space for something I lost along the way. Trust, family. Emma exchanged a surprised glance with Ryan. This wasn't just an apology, it was transformation. That's a big step, she said. Alexander gave a tired smile. It's long overdue. At that moment, the kitchen door opened, and a few other family members from the previous night entered. They looked uncertain, clearly still digesting the events of the evening. But when Alexander greeted them warmly, without judgment or superiority, the tone shifted. A tentative conversation began. Small jokes were shared. Laughter even bubbled up once or twice. It wasn't a miracle, but it was real. Later that afternoon, Alexander pulled Emma aside once more. He handed her a small velvet box. This was your mother's, he said. She gave it back to me when she left, and I haven't touched it since, but I think she'd want you to have it. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, engraved with the initials RF. Ryan's mother's name. Emma's voice caught. I don't know what to say. Alexander placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Just keep being you. That's all I ask. For the first time, Emma saw not the billionaire, not the test giver, but a man who was trying, finally, to reconnect with the parts of himself he'd buried long ago. But not everyone was ready to accept the transformation so easily. As the days passed and word spread within the extended family about what had happened during that infamous dinner, whispers began to surface. Some cousins and distant relatives who had long positioned themselves close to Alexander for financial favor began to cast doubt on Emma's character. At a brunch a week later, one of them, a sharp-tongued woman named Clarissa, who had always considered herself superior, leaned across the table and said loudly enough for others to hear, "It's funny how some people always know just the right moment to do something noble, when it will be seen." Emma looked up, confused, but Clarissa continued, "I mean, handing a meal to a poor man right before meeting a billionaire? Quite the coincidence." The remark stung more than Emma expected. She had braved judgment, passed Alexander's unpredictable test, and still, some were ready to paint her as manipulative. Ryan immediately bristled. "That's enough, Clarissa. She didn't know it was my father. She thought he was homeless. She acted from kindness, not strategy." Clarissa raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "So she says." Another cousin, Edward, chimed in with a smirk. "It's hard to tell these days. Everyone plays the game." Emma's heart pounded. She stood, voice calm but cutting. "I don't need to prove myself to you. I didn't do it for points. I did it because it was the right thing, and because I know what it's like to be overlooked. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe ask yourself why." The room fell quiet. Clarissa looked around for support but found none. The moment passed, but the seed of doubt she'd planted lingered, at least until Alexander entered. He had overheard the exchange and walked directly to the table, his presence silencing even the boldest voices. "Let me be clear," he said, voice firm. "Emma did more in 5 minutes than most of you have done in years. She reminded me what decency looks like. If you can't respect her, you'll find yourselves very far from this table in the future." No one dared to reply. Clarissa looked as though she had bitten into something bitter, and Edward quickly excused himself. Emma exhaled, not just in relief, but in affirmation. Alexander had taken her side, not as a test, not for appearances, but because he truly believed in her now. Ryan squeezed her hand under the table, whispering, "You're incredible." Emma didn't feel incredible. She felt tired, but also vindicated. She had walked into this family with an open heart and been met with suspicion, schemes, and now slander. But she had stood her ground. Integrity, it seemed, still had power, even in rooms full of wealth and cynicism. Later that day, Alexander called a private meeting with some of his most trusted relatives and announced a shift in how his estate and influence would be managed. He made it clear that values, not manipulation, would guide his legacy from now on. And though not everyone was thrilled, they understood that the game had changed, and Emma had helped change it. In the weeks that followed, Alexander took deliberate steps to demonstrate that his transformation was more than just words. He publicly supported Emma and Ryan's relationship, including them in family events and even bringing Emma into several of his charitable initiatives. At a high-profile fundraiser for homelessness in the city, he surprised everyone by inviting Emma to speak. She hesitated at first, overwhelmed by the idea of standing before a crowd of wealthy donors and sharing something so personal, but eventually agreed. The night of the event, under a crystal chandelier in a grand ballroom, Emma stood at the podium, wearing a simple black dress and holding a folded sheet of paper. The room quieted as she began. "A few weeks ago," she said, "I gave my lunch to a man I thought was hungry and alone. I didn't know he was a billionaire. I didn't know he was the father of the man I love. I just saw someone who needed help." She paused, scanning the room. Kindness isn't supposed to be a performance. It's something you do when no one is looking. But that day, someone was looking, and that moment changed everything. The crowd was rapt. Emma spoke about her upbringing, her mother's struggles, and the importance of compassion that transcends status. "We talk a lot about giving," she concluded, "but the most valuable gift you can give is dignity. Treating someone like they matter, even when they have nothing, is the kind of wealth that can't be bought or inherited." As she stepped down, the room erupted in applause. Alexander, standing nearby, had tears in his eyes. After the event, he approached her with a solemn expression and handed her a manila envelope. "This is for you," he said. "I wasn't sure when the right moment would be." Inside was a letter, handwritten, and a legal document. The letter expressed his admiration, his apology for how their first meeting unfolded, and his gratitude for reminding him of who he once was. The document was something else entirely, a trust, created in her name, to be used only for projects that addressed poverty and dignity, initiatives she could lead. Emma was speechless. "Why me?" she asked softly. Alexander looked her in the eye. "Because I trust you, and because you prove that power isn't always loud. It's often quiet, patient, and rooted in kindness." Ryan joined them, wrapping an arm around her. He smiled at his father. "For once, I think you got it right." Alexander laughed gently. "Let's not make it a habit." But there was something else in that envelope, too. A photo. It was a candid shot taken during the dinner, showing Emma as she entered the room and saw Alexander for the first time, her expression a mix of shock and confusion. On the back, Alexander had written in neat script, "The moment the truth began." Emma held it close, understanding now that she had not only passed a test, she had reshaped a family's future. The shift within the Ford family became more evident with time. Ryan and Emma moved into a modest home nearby, choosing not to live in the Ford estate despite Alexander's offer. They wanted to build their own life, grounded in the values that had brought them together in the first place. Alexander visited often, always unannounced and without fanfare, bringing books for Emma and old photographs for Ryan, as if trying to repair lost years through small, steady gestures. The rest of the family adapted slowly. Some relatives distanced themselves, resentful of the new order and skeptical of Alexander's change. Others, like his younger sister Margaret, embraced the shift, grateful to see warmth return to her brother's eyes. At Sunday dinners, laughter replaced tension, and Emma became the quiet anchor of the group, never seeking attention, but always commanding respect. One afternoon, as Emma was organizing donation materials for a shelter they were funding through Alexander's new foundation, she found herself alone with him on the back patio. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the table where they sat. Alexander looked out over the garden, then turned to her. "You know, I used to believe that power was about control," he said. "Owning everything, predicting every move. But I was wrong. Power is being able to change course. To admit when you've lost your way, and still have the courage to begin again." Emma listened quietly, allowing the words to settle. "You didn't just change course," she replied. "You chose honesty. That's harder than anything." He nodded slowly. "And I learned it from someone who didn't owe me anything, who didn't even know who I was, and still chose to see me." Emma smiled. "You were never invisible, Alexander, just guarded. But we all have our masks. The question is whether we're brave enough to take them off." A moment of silence passed between them, filled with mutual respect. Later that evening, Ryan joined them, carrying a folder with blueprints for a new community center they were planning to build. The three of them reviewed the plans together, each offering ideas, each willing to listen. It wasn't just a project. It was a symbol of what they were becoming as a family. For the first time, decisions weren't made from a place of suspicion, but from shared vision. Emma looked at both men, realizing how far they had come. What began as a strange, almost cruel test had evolved into something neither of them had expected: healing. They weren't perfect, but they were honest. And in that honesty, they had found something rare. Trust rebuilt not from comfort, but from challenge. And it was stronger because of it. Years later, as Emma sat at the head of a long wooden table surrounded by community leaders, volunteers, and young families, she reflected on how far everything had come. The community center she and Ryan had helped build was thriving. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of second chances, of people being seen, heard, and valued. Behind her, a large photo hung on the wall, showing a candid moment of her handing a lunchbox to a man sitting on the sidewalk. That photo had become iconic, not because of the people in it, but because of what it represented: a reminder that every person carries a story, and sometimes the most unexpected encounters reveal the deepest truths. Alexander had passed away peacefully a year earlier, leaving behind a legacy not of financial empires, but of lives touched and lessons learned. His will had one final letter addressed to Emma. In it, he wrote, "Thank you for reminding me that the world is not divided into those who give and those who take. You taught me that dignity is not found in wealth or status, but in the courage to be kind when no one is watching. You were never being tested. I was." Emma had cried reading those words. They had captured everything: her doubts, her strength, her journey. Now, as she stood to speak to a new generation of leaders at the center, she began with the same words she had spoken years ago. "Kindness isn't supposed to be a performance. It's something you do when no one is watching." She paused, scanning the hopeful faces before her. "But sometimes someone is watching. And when they are, let your kindness be the thing they remember." The room erupted in quiet applause. Ryan stood in the back, their two children beside him, pride shining in his eyes. Emma smiled at them, her heart full. She had started with nothing but integrity and compassion, and somehow, that had changed everything. She hadn't just joined a powerful family, she had transformed it. And in the process, built something of her own. The mansion, the money, the tests, they had all faded into the background. What remained was something far more enduring: the quiet power of doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's invisible. Because the truth is, real strength isn't found in what you inherit, but in who you choose to be. Emma had chosen, and because of that choice, everything else had followed.